If you're watching this video right now and it looks weird, don't be alarmed. That's because we're presenting this in ultra-wide. This is the kind of aspect ratio that you can play a bunch of games in if you use specific hardware. What kind of hardware do you need, and what games make use of it? Well, let's find out. The widescreen aspect ratio has been a standard for a pretty long time now, but it wasn't always that way. Initially, when we were playing video games, we were using the 4:3 aspect ratio, and most gamers out there just assume that we're never really going to change to another one, at least anytime soon. But that might be something that's changing for a couple of gamers out there who have entered the realm of the ultra-wide screen monitor. Gaming in this aspect ratio can be very different, and in some ways can improve upon the way you experience a game. But of course, in order to do ultra-wide screen gaming properly, you're gonna need some hardware. We reached out to the folks at Asus, and they loaned us a Designo MX34 VQ 34-inch 21:9 ultra-wide curved LCD monitor. Now, as I just mentioned, the monitor is actually curved, and this is something that I normally don't care about when it comes to smaller widescreen monitors, but when you've got an ultra-wide monitor this size, it does make a difference. And having that curve gives you a very different perspective over anything you're looking at because the screen takes over your entire peripheral vision. This means that if you're sitting just close enough, everything you're looking at is gonna be whatever's on that screen. It just feels really immersive. This specific screen has a whole bunch of additional features like adaptive sync and a wireless charging base station just underneath the monitor itself. And these things are cool, but it's the resolution that I care about. At 3440 by 1440, this is much larger and much bigger than a 1080p screen. And because of that, we needed a little bit of extra horsepower to run games at that resolution. So the folks at Asus stepped in once again and loaned us one of their brand new desktop computers called the Republic of Gaming Strix GL12. This is one of their latest gaming desktops they've released, and it's rocking some pretty hefty specs. An Intel Core i7 8700K processor, 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, and finally an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080 graphics card with 8 gigabytes of discrete memory. All this hardware had to go back pretty soon, so I had to sit there for a straight week playing tons and tons of video games. It was just torture. So the first game I tried out was Alan Wake, and Alan Wake is a fairly cinematic game, and because of that, you really do get a nice feel when you're using it in ultra-wide resolutions. Now the gameplay itself, when you're in-engine, that stuff actually does project in the correct aspect ratio, but when you get into the main menu, and sometimes when you get into certain video sequences, the game just knocks back to the original widescreen resolution. For some gamers, the switching up of aspect ratios might pull you out of the experience, but for me personally, I was okay with it. As long as the gameplay remained consistent and solid, whenever it jumped to a movie sequence, it really didn't bug me that much. Some games have a very interesting trick to dealing with the aspect ratio change. Batman Arkham Asylum has this really interesting way of kind of squeezing the image down and opening it up while you're playing a cutscene or getting into the game itself. It's nice to see because it keeps you in the experience and keeps the flow going of the whole visual presentation. All the video cutscenes in this game were originally rendered in 16:9 aspect ratio, so there really wasn't any way for them to go back and change them unless they were to re-render them, and I just don't think there was a big enough reason to do that. But when you actually do see the main menu, you see some elements that just stick out because they're not being properly rendered. And the same thing happens in Arkham Origins as well. I can't really blame the developers though because, well, this wasn't really an aspect ratio that people were utilizing a lot back then. In fact, when you play a slightly older game like Crysis, you can really see the problems that come into play. Yes, the game will run in ultra widescreen resolution when you just normally play the game, but during cutscenes, which are done in-engine, they utilized a forced aspect ratio in 16:9 to basically tell the gamer that they were watching a cutscene. And they did that with just an image overlay of a black bar at the top and bottom. Unfortunately, I don't think they were even aware that ultra-wide monitors were going to be a thing, so that little black bar is actually only 16:9 at the top and bottom, so you can still see outside of that scope. It just looks kind of funny, and I'm pretty sure with some modifications you could get rid of it, but normally they're just right there. A lot of video game developers have gone back and updated their old games to work with ultra widescreen resolutions, and you'll also find a bunch of independent modders and even game companies that have gone back to remaster older games have at least added the option for that aspect ratio. For example, a whole bunch of games that use the Source engine will work in ultra wide, including Half-Life 2 Episode 2 and even Dota 2. And if you're willing to look around online and find some mods, you'll find that even older games will be able to run in ultra-wide resolutions like Deus Ex. All you need to do is download the Deus Ex Revision mod, and there you go. The game will run in that aspect ratio, and it's actually pretty fun to play this way. But unfortunately, sometimes you'll come across a game that will be able to run in that aspect ratio, but it has a number of issues. Bioshock Remastered will run this way, and it looks pretty cool up until a point, and then when you get to the area where you can actually see your hands and arms, you can see all the model that was initially never seen in the 16:9 version of the game. But call me crazy, even though you can see those graphical glitches, the game still looks really nice. And it's kind of interesting to see a little bit more of the model that you normally couldn't see, even if it looks really awkward. There was a bunch of games I played in single player that felt really cool in 21:9. Alien Isolation was this great game to play because you could have this larger scope and it made you feel like you were really paying attention to all the corners of the screen, just peering out for that alien that could be around at every corner. The new release of Hitman, which happens to be one of my personal favorite releases of the past couple of years, looks fantastic. Traveling to Italy and looking down the streets of Sapienza really is something else. It almost makes you feel like you're there sometimes. And as an added perk, that additional screen real estate really does help when you're trying to pay attention to the targets you're tracking. Practically any single player experience you're gonna play that has a lot of details in the world can really stand out with this aspect ratio. While it is true that it might not benefit gameplay so much, it does look really awesome. And The Witness is one of those games that when you play it, it just has this world that you really desperately want to explore. And being able to have this open scope just makes you feel like sometimes you don't know if it's real or not. Any kind of game with an open world environment does stand out when you use a screen like this because it feels like you're exploring and looking at things a lot harder, especially with Deus Ex Mankind Divided, which can be played a multitude of ways, but whenever I play it, I always try to do the pacifist run. And this is a great way to do that because you can pay attention to enemies a lot easier. And speaking of paying attention to your enemies, let's talk about racing games like Burnout Paradise and Project Cars. Those are games where you have to focus on your rivals and, in some cases, knock them off the road. And that's one of the ways that an ultra-wide monitor can really benefit you because you can just see so much more around the car and even inside the car. If you love simulation racing games, having a monitor like this is simply a must. The list goes on and on for games that feature ultra-wide resolutions, like Stardew Valley, which, although only has one or two graphical glitches at the beginning, the majority of the game seems to play pretty well in this aspect ratio. But you'll also get games like Dangerous Golf and Defcon, Danger Zone, Besieged, and Auto Age, and so many other games that look great in ultra-wide. But folks, I believe there are two even bigger reasons why you should be getting this. And the first one is, well, if you want an advantage over your competitors online, multiplayer games really make ultra-wide a must. Virtually every online game I can think of has a benefit to using the 21:9 aspect ratio because you can see farther than your competition. When you're playing Rainbow Six Siege, you're one step up against everybody else. You don't need to quickly dart your vision left and right to keep everything in frame because with an ultra-wide, everything's in frame. When you're playing a game like Star Wars Battlefront, not only does it feel way more cinematic when you're flying with an X-Wing, but you can see far more in the cockpit than anyone else it's playing. Unless, of course, that is, they also have an ultra-wide monitor. And while we're on the topic of EA and DICE games that use the Frostbite engine, Battlefield 1 looks amazing with this aspect ratio. It feels incredibly cinematic, especially when you're playing those really cool Lawrence of Arabia sequences. Every multiplayer game I played always gave me an advantage over everyone else, and I took my older experiences playing the game on a regular widescreen monitor and compared it to this, and well, I typically did better. PUBG, I just survived longer. Overwatch, I got a better score. Grand Theft Auto 5, I was capable of seeing people coming at me before they could see me. It just worked a lot better. I guess the best way to explain it is that I was just more aware of the game world in front of me, and because of that I was capable of timing my movements and attacks to just match everything that was going on. In some games you can adjust the field of view so that you can see a lot more around you, but for me typically, I find that that viewpoint makes me feel kind of sick and gives me this tunnel vision that just doesn't work. With this screen, I'm keeping the field of view normal and I can just see a lot more. Now if all of that wasn't reason enough to get an ultra-wide monitor, monitor, I think my second reason is gonna really put a lot of retro gamers over the edge. Some of you may know this and some of you might not, but there were a lot of arcade games that were released that actually utilized multiple monitors. And these games were basically the first ultra-wide video games ever made. And when you play the Multiple Arcade Machine emulator, otherwise known as MAME, you're gonna be able to play these games in a way you haven't been able to play ever since they were first released. If you're a fan of Tecmo Bowl, specifically the arcade release, there's a 2-screen version of that plays really well on this monitor. But I think when it comes to 2-player screen games, a lot of people like to talk about this one, X-Men, the 6-player version. Oh yeah, when you play this game, it really stands out. And I think if you're ever gonna play it, you're gonna wanna play it like this at home. You're able to see everything that you normally would only ever see in the arcade release with the 2 screens. This is one of those games I always felt got lost in translation when you played it on a regular TV. But ever since we got ultra high resolutions and ultra wide screens, we're able to play this at home pretty easily. You can also play 2-screen arcade games that are technically 2 individual instances of an arcade game being played at once on the same system. These games can be played together or separately, and they're kind of fun to see them work this way. But if you really want to test out that screen, you gotta play any of the Darius games. The Darius aspect ratio is actually even larger than an ultra widescreen monitor, so even that's gonna be cropped a little. But with this screen, we've gotten closer than we've ever gotten to in the past to getting this aspect ratio to be as close to the original arcade release as possible. There's only a handful of arcade games out there that utilize this really large aspect ratio, and even though they aren't very common, the ones that do exist are on MAME and they're pretty fun to play, including a couple of prototypes like Race Drive-In, which is an arcade game that I was really familiar with, but I had no idea that there was this panoramic mode version that was out there. These older arcade games that use multiple monitors to make a wider aspect ratio are just so interesting to me. And while it is true you could get multiple monitors and put them side to side, I don't really want to see the borders on them. I just like this uninterrupted, clean image that you're seeing right here. I love the way that this looks. And there are a few arcade games being released out there to this day that still utilize this really big widescreen format, like Darius Burst Chronicle Saviors, which is a new Darius game that you can buy right now on Steam that retains that original aspect ratio. And even though you do get a bar at the top and bottom, even playing it on an ultra-wide monitor, I still prefer that because it looks a lot better than on a 16:9 screen. Most of these arcade releases are becoming older and harder to come by, and as the time goes on, the best way to play them is through emulation, and with a screen like this, you couldn't ask for anything better. Ultrawide gaming probably isn't going to be for everyone out there because it can be a little bit expensive and restrictive, and not every game out there does work in that aspect ratio. But for the ones that do, I personally believe it's the way to go. Those games can just be way more fun to play, and in many cases, they feel like whole new experiences.